Hi, everybody, and welcome to our session today on applied flight path management. This is going to be a great session with our panelists that you can see here. We're going to be interactive. We're going to approach it from a scenario standpoint. We're also going to talk about Advisory Circular 120, 123 flight path management in some detail, but I really want to double down on applied so we can give some tools and resources and strategies and methods for professional pilots to be able to use in their day-to-day flight operations. So we're going to go ahead and run the intro, come back to do that. We're going to start with Captain John Cox, who is with me here today. You can see our special guests, including Captain Cox, also Warren Patori from the Florida Institute of Technology, and APS senior instructors, Captain Clark McNeese and Norm DeCare. So it's going to be a great event. Let's do that, and let's get back here with John to get things kicked off. Great. Well, we have a great event for everybody here today, and I have my special guest with us, Captain John Cox, and our other panelists are waiting in the waiting room. It's great to have you here, John. Any comments before we get going on your introduction by Otter?
No, just thanks for the invitation, BJ.
Great. Wonderful to have you here. Otter, why don't you go ahead and introduce John for us?
It is definitely my great honor and privilege to introduce our next event speaker, Captain John Cox of Safety Operating Systems, where he is the president and CEO. He's got a long list of accomplishments. Let me touch on just a few of them. He has an MBA in aviation management from Daniel Webster College. He is a graduate of the U.S. Navy Postgraduate School Aviation Safety Command Program. He's an IOSA and ISBEO auditor. From a flying standpoint, John is a highly experienced airline, corporate, and general aviation pilot with over 14,000 hours, 10,000 of which are in command of air carriers. He's held positions as instructor, check pilot, and test pilot. He's typed in the Airbus, Boeing, Fokker, and various citation models. He also has an extensive safety background where he is the former executive air safety chairman for the Airline Pilots Association. He's the recipient of the Sir James Martin Award, which is ALPA's Air Safety Award, and U.S. Airways Air Safety Achievement Award. He's also been an accident investigator, working with the NTSB on numerous major airline accidents. He's a go-to expert for the news media, such as ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, Aviation Week, Time Magazine, and many more. He appears as an expert on the television program Air Disasters and Why Planes Crash. He's a fellow at the Royal Aeronautical Society, where his most recent paper, Upset Recovery Training History, Core Concepts, and Mitigation, is recently published. You may see him appearing in the USA Today column, Ask the Captain. I have known him personally for the last 18 years, and he's just a great guy, fantastic leader, and I consider him a great friend and mentor. It's great to have you, John.
Great. Thank you, Otter, for that, John. We're going to be talking about AC 120, 123 flight path management. We're going to jump into some of the technical recommendations like instructor training and so forth a little bit later, but we wanted to really bring you in to kick the event off. I know you can't stay for Q&A because of your flight out of Hawaii. So why don't we just go over to you to share your thoughts to kick things off for us?
Well, thank you, BJ. Flight path management is really a pretty broad term. And it says that the track of the aircraft is as intended by the crew. In other words, it's managed. And it comes in a lot of different ways in today's modern airplanes, where we use auto flight a tremendous amount. So we have to understand the limitations of our auto flight system, the programming, so that when the airplane is in auto flight, that it in fact does follow the track both laterally and vertically to ensure that the airplane's where it should be. That takes briefing, it takes training, it takes experience, but it also takes careful monitoring. And that is both a pilot flying function and a pilot monitoring function, and that there's agreement in things like the changing altitudes. Is there agreement that that is the assigned altitude, the correct altitude, and that the auto flight system is going to go to that altitude, or is there some other entry in the flight management computer that's going to stop it? So these are the sorts of things in managing the flight path. One, as another example, is tailwinds during descent with the crossing restriction. Is the airplane actually going to make it? And because it says it is, as it starts down out of 35,000 feet with a 100-knot tailwind that increases on the way down, it may very well not make it. And that managing that the flight path to ensure that during auto flight, that the airplane goes where the pilot intends for it to, where the crew intends for it to, then that's one of the two major issues with flight path management. The other is when you're in manual flight and you're physically flying the airplane and then doing maneuvers such as a circling approach, as an example, or right after departure, particularly if there's a problem, that the flight path is safe, but it's also what is intended by the crew. And this requires additional briefing. It requires additional understanding, and it may very well require the intervention of the pilot monitoring, because as a pilot gets task saturated, things begin to happen physiologically. Things such as cognitive processing speed and ability begins to drop. The visual cues around the pilot will begin to decrease, and auditory exclusion begins to occur. And it's not a binary thing here. It's incremental, and that's one of the things that's so insidious about it. And it's one of the areas where a pilot that is monitoring must be aware and must fully understand what the pilot flying intent is. And is it reasonable? And lastly, is the airplane doing what the pilot briefed some time back? And if there's a divergence, it's bringing it to their attention, and even to the point of saying, look, this isn't going to work. We need to go around. And forcing that go around to keep the airplane from being in too close, having to make too tight a turn. With any loss of speed on it, now you're into a stall or worse spin condition. And we end up, as we've seen in some tragic accidents during circling approaches. So all of these things constitute flight path management. It's knowing what needs to be done and then executing it with precision, whether it's in auto flight or whether it is in manual flight. The need is the same. The tools to successfully execute it are the same. But historically, we have viewed it a little bit differently. And I think with the new AC that's come out and the improving training that we're seeing with flight path management and some of the research that's been done that proves the need for this, that we can actually improve the safety record for some of these challenging maneuvers when in manual flight, but in the automated flight section, where we don't have the altitude deviations, where we don't have the lateral deviations, where the airplane tracks the path that air traffic control expects, that the pilot flying expects. So flight path management, I think, has become increasingly an area of focus for us, for those of us in safety. And I think that it's good. I think that focus is well timed, and that we can actually improve the safety record that we've enjoyed up till now.
Cool. Great, John. That's a great way to introduce. And it's, as you were talking, I was just reflecting on the definition of loss of control in flight as an extreme manifestation of a deviation from the intended flight path. So really what you were talking about, and a few things also that we see is over the years, you talked about the role of a CRM, pilot flying, pilot not flying, or pilot monitoring. And when I think back on it, there's been an evolution in how we further mitigate the risk in aviation. The first one was CRM, the introduction of that, crew resource management. Then we had threat and error management. And then now, which is related to this particular advisory circular, is upset prevention and recovery training. And the way I look at Advisory Circular 120, 123, it really sharpens the sword on the prevention side of UPRT with flight path management. Do you have thoughts on kind of the CREM-TEM or UPRT implementation, or anything to add before you go? I won't keep you more than one more minute, John, if you have that much time.
Initially, when we started talking about upset recovery training after some of the airline accidents, it became in focus. And correctly, several people brought out is the recovery techniques are important, but the prevention is even more important.
Yes.
And so it evolved into, let's prevent the problem first. Then if the problem does continue, let's make sure that people have the skills to recover from it. But the prevention is intervene early, to recognize the divergence early. And if you do that, the corrections can be pretty small. But if you wait until the airplane is about to depart control flight, there's some pretty heavy duty things that have to go on in that point. So the recognition, and it's not by a single pilot. That is the key element within the crew resource management part of this, is to say it has to be both pilots, and both pilots have to be on the same page. And
Yeah.
I listened to a crew brief the other day, and there was a wide difference in age and experience level between the two pilots. And the more experienced captain was, yeah, it's fine. I know what we're going to do. I've been flying the jet for thousands upon thousands of hours. The other junior captain wasn't sure what he had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a breakdown in CRM. It also cuts 50% of your flight path management error detection out of the loop, because they don't know what you're going to do. And so for this, I think it's very important to recognize that we brief what we intend to do, and then watch the airplane as as it executes our plan, to make sure that deviation does not begin to show up and or grow. But it takes both pilots.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think those are really, really great points. When I think back on it, is that for many years we talk about pitch attitude, we talk about energy management, which is all still important. But the nice thing about flight path management, it integrates the understanding of angle of attack. In other words, the difference between where the wing is pointing and where it's going, and an understanding of how that is influenced by the energy on the airplane, whether that's potential or kinetic. So really, even the terminology of this particular advisory circular is much more focused or pointed towards the knowledge that pilots really need to be successful in a diversity of situations, including just day-to-day operation, handling the airplane, and flight envelope awareness, for sure.
We see too many opportunities where air traffic will take an opportunity to say, okay, can you maintain 170 to the marker? If you can, I can get you in ahead of 4 other airplanes. Well, everybody takes that, but knowing that you've now put the airplane in a high energy state 4 to 5 miles from the end of the runway, we need to brief how we're going to do that.
Yeah.
Even if it's a quick brief of, okay, I'm going to get the gear at the marker and we're going to slow. We'll be configured by 1,000 feet or we'll miss. And I've got the ILS tuned up, approaches armed. All of that, it tells the monitoring pilot what the plan is, as opposed to just watching and hoping and seeing that you stay between a set of parameters. It actually tells them what you're going to do. And that can be essential if you get task saturated during this process, that you're already pushing the limitations of the airplane. But now, if you get task saturated, your cognitive ability to execute it can begin to degrade.
Well, I think it's a recent wonderful development of threat and error management, the threat forward briefing that they have now, which is at top of descent. What is our number one risk in this particular approach and identifying? Could be the circle to land. It could be actually a decision even to do a circle to land, let alone the final turn associated with it. What the point is, threat forward is what is the biggest risk that we're facing and how are we going to mitigate it, and talking about it before you even start the descent going into the airfield. And I think there's a lot of evolution going on now in how crews are more safely operating airplanes, being more thoughtful about what they could face. And to your point, getting agreement on what they're going to do in advance instead of trying to handle it in the heat of the moment. John, anything
Absolutely.
else to add on that? I know you need to go ahead, sir. Wrap it up. I know you need to go.
No, I was going to say the recent circling approach accidents, all the airplanes are in very tight, tighter than they needed to be.
Yes.
And that is one of the things that can cause that beginning, that task saturation to start setting in. And the airmanship demands that now really go up very high in a condition where you're not processing information as rapidly or as efficiently. So if we can say, all right, we're going to be outside the normal traffic pattern because we're going to circle, we're going to be out here, a mile and a half to 2 miles, that may be very good and very necessary, because that may give you the time and the geographic area to not get task saturated, to manage the flight path.
Exactly. Well, the good news is what's coming up next is going to be a discussion on briefing on some situations, including a circle to land. So I think we're going to be able to put your sage advice and insights into practice here with some applied applications of flight path management. So with that, John, thank you so much for being with us today. Have a safe flight.
Thanks a lot, BJ. Good to see you, and thanks again for the invitation.
Oh, our pleasure always. All right, let's go ahead and go to our full panel now to carry it forward from here with John's great words of wisdom to get us going.
I think you're muted, BJ.
You're muted, BJ.
There I am telling you guys to make sure you're unmuted, and I'm the one not muted, so it just makes it more real light. So there's a live event. So let's do some introductions here. I know we've had a bit already, but I think it's important to understand who everybody is. I'll start with Otter, then Otter, you can do DQ, then over to Warren, then we'll jump right into the content. So Otter is our Executive Vice President of Compliance and Standards, 14,000 hours, airline pilot, multi-time master CFI, ATP CFI, II, MEI, AGI, over, I think, 4,500, maybe 5,000 hours now of all attitude instruction. I was in the Navy, flew F-18s, flew in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and then really 35 years of experience. But also, I think, of importance, not only being an advanced instructor, but really being involved in some of the drafting of these advisory circulars, for example, such as a related one, Advisory Circular 120-109A now, which is stall prevention and recovery training. That group of AC 120 is associated with aircraft control, of which upset prevention recovery training is part of it. So Otter, over to you to introduce DQ, and then DQ to Warren.
Yeah, it's great to have DQ on the team the last number of years with us here at APS. He comes to us with a lot of expertise, 32 years in aviation experience, 13 years in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and much of that as a military flight instructor, 7 years specifically as a Canadian Class 1 instructor, certainly CFI here as well in the States. Very successful in the Canadian Air Force, was actually invited to be on the Canadian Air Demonstration Squadron, the Snowbirds, 2 times, in fact. there. He's an A1 category instructor rating. So it's great to have him with us. Oh, as well, 15 years instructing at the Royal Saudi Air Force there in Saudi Arabia. So thanks, DQ, for being on this.
Thanks for that, Otter. And it's my pleasure to introduce Warren to the group. Warren Pittori, he's a flight education chair of Florida Tech. I first met Warren a few years ago at NBAA base, and two things struck me, actually three. One was how young he was. Two was he's just very personable, just a natural instructor in the way that he communicates with people. But the final one was the intelligence with what we were discussing, because at the time we were talking about use of VR and how we could potentially use that to enhance loss of control in-flight training. Warren has a bachelor's degree in aeronautical science with flight, a master's degree in aviation human factors, a PhD in aviation science. He's a certified ground and flight instructor for single and multi-engine land and sea. And he's currently the co-chair for the Loss of Control in Flight Working Group in the NBAA Safety Committee. He's an absolute pleasure to work with, and I don't think that we can say more about how qualified he is to speak to the current subject. Over to you, Warren.
Welcome, Warren. And I think that the nice part about this as we were prepping for the call was that, we talked about how, Warren being at the Florida Institute of Technology, working with ab initio students on their way to careers in the air carriers or regionals and so forth, and then being able to have a full spectrum application of the concept of flight path management starting at the student level and really landing at the air carrier level. We're going to try to span that today in some extent to really make sure that we cover as many of the areas of applied flight path management as we possibly can. So let's go ahead and bring our slides in here. Just to be clear for everybody on the call, what is flight path management? So as defined by Advisory Circular 12123, flight path management is the planning, execution, and assurance of the guidance and control of aircraft trajectory and energy in flight or on the ground. Flight path means trajectory, lateral, longitudinal, and vertical, and energy state of the aircraft. So it's a very important concept. In fact, it really is founded in manual flight operation proficiency and simply just the fundamentals of flying. So flight path management should be the priority in all that we do all the time as pilots, whether it's manual flight or automated flight. So I'm just introducing now the scenario we're going to get into a little bit later. We're going to have some discussion, some general discussion here a little bit. Once we've had our general discussion, we're going to have Warren talk about his experience, what he's seeing and his role. And then also DQ is going to have some comment. Then we're going to come back with Otter, who's going to take us through an actual scenario of applied flight path management. And we're going to introduce the concept of a threat forward briefing. This can be one of the items we hope the pilots watching who don't do this or aren't aware of it consider, updating or revising. I won't say upgrading, but perhaps considering a little bit more dimension in how they prepare going into, for example, approach, although threat forward is in any area of the flight operation. So with that, Warren, when we were preparing, you were talking a little bit about how you wanted to share some of your experiences, maybe even a story or two, to kind of give your perspective on not only AC 123, but also what you're seeing in your role as a professional instructor and a pilot.
Absolutely. Being here at Florida Tech for 5 years now, twice a year we have a career fair, which has been primarily airlines coming to recruit our students. But the past couple of years, more 135 operators have been attending. In fact, just a few months ago, one of our instructors, a personal friend of mine, reached his minimum flight hours of 1,000 for the restricted ATP and was hired by NetJets. He just finished his Phenom 300 type rating training a few days ago. If you go back a few months, the fastest, most complex airplane he flew was a Piper Seminole. So the gap between the primary flight training and the 135 industry is shrinking. And so it's important that the training we give our students carries over to the 121 or 135 world. In AC 12123, the FAA makes several references. Yes, the advisory circular is geared towards 121 and 135 operations, but it shouldn't be limited to those operations. Any pilot, any operator can use the information in this advisory circular to develop their own tools. I do want to share a short personal story. This happened yesterday. The timing couldn't be more perfect. I am still a part-time flight instructor, mostly tailwheel, but I do some multi-engine training. And this particular student has her commercial, she has her instrument rating, and a few hours in the multi, we use twin engine Piper Seminole. And there's a short list of tasks that she'll have to do for her check ride, one of which is not a circling approach. And yet we decided to do a circling approach. And this comes out of chapter 3 in the advisory circular, which is manual aircraft control. I think all the pilots on the call today can reflect back to their primary flight training. You manually flew that aircraft almost the entire time. Some of our aircraft do have basic autopilot systems, but any instrument approach, any maneuver, we have the students hand fly every single one of them. But within chapter 3 in the advisory circular, it talks about type specific aircraft training. And I did not want this student, the first time she flew a circling approach, to be in the real world under IMC in an unfamiliar aircraft. So I said, why don't we fly a circling approach? It's not required for the check ride, but let's get some experience doing it. We always begin our instrument approaches with our WIRE checklist, WIRE. We analyze the weather, set up our instruments and our radios, and then we end with a briefing of the approach plate. She did a beautiful job, but I noticed she didn't relate the current weather to the procedure, the circling approach. She wasn't thinking threat forward. Well, we conducted the circle. The beginning of it went fairly well. Turns out when we were on final approach, we had a quartering crosswind from our right-hand side. When she started her circle, that turned into a tailwind. So she had about 15 extra knots in a Piper Seminole, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in light GA piston aircraft, 15 knots makes a big difference. And she ended up overshooting final. There was a moment when she realized she overshot the runway, some ADM kicked in, and she had a decision to make. Does she go missed and attempt the procedure again? Or does she, carefully maneuver the aircraft back to the center line? And she chose the latter. And I'll jump to the end of the story. When we were debriefing on the ground, I said, what helped you make that decision to continue with the approach versus going around? And she quoted 91-175. She was in a safe position to land, didn't need any excessive maneuvers to get the airplane back to the center line. She had a lot of distance between the aircraft and the threshold of the runway, so plenty of time. She was at the right altitude, the right airspeed. The aircraft was configured correctly, so she felt comfortable getting the airplane back onto that center line. And BJ, we can cycle to the next slide. I'll finish talking about chapter 5 from the advisory circular. It talks about pilot monitoring. And in our world, Part 91, primary flight instruction, we don't use the terms pilot flying and pilot monitoring all that often. When you think about the role as an instructor, your student is the sole manipulator of the flight controls. They are pilot flying. You're monitoring the situation. And at some point, you may need to intervene. And what we see on the screen, we'll probably talk about this a little bit throughout the session, is the loss of control in-flight escalation spectrum. The very end of the spectrum on the right-hand side is your worst case scenario, an accident that results from a loss of control or an upset scenario. My student was operating somewhere in the middle in that prevention phase. So there were a couple factors that existed on this approach that she didn't catch at first. She caught them when the Swiss cheese lined up in our Swiss cheese model and she overshot the runway. The first bullet there says ADM. So the student was faced with a situation, I overshot the runway, what do I do next? If she was at a high altitude, high airspeed, had a lot of energy, and had to use something unusual to get that airplane back on her trajectory, that would have been a time to intervene. And the last thing I shared with the student, I showed her this exact image. I said, in your situation, fairly new aircraft, fairly new instrument procedure, you haven't flown a lot, I think it's perfectly acceptable that she was operating in that prevention phase. When you get more experience with your type aircraft, with these procedures, you can stay in that awareness phase. You'll recognize that crosswind that will become a tailwind early on the approach. And you can factor that into your briefing. Hey, when I start my circle, I might roll out a little bit early to that center line because I'll have that increased ground speed. So again, my job today was taking this advisory circular and bringing it right back to primary flight training for our students.
Great, Warren. Thank you. And I think your reference to the diagram is not only apt, but it's instructive, as you talked about. But I will bring attention to everybody watching, if you've seen this for the first time. If you take a look at all those bubbles or balloons in the funnel, you see that little red one that continues from the left all the way to the right. And what we're talking about today is that pilots are busy all the time, essentially mitigating risk by taking a pin and popping those balloons. And what ends up happening, if one of them makes it through the various layers of defenses, it can propagate itself all the way to the right. So, effective flight path management, you can see that right in the middle where Warren was talking about, applies throughout the process. But very often the first part of prevention is recognizing an issue with flight path management. I thought that was a great example, Warren. DQ, did you want to add to what Warren had, or do you want to have your own perspective there on this?
Yeah, thanks, BJ. Probably a little bit of both, actually. I just love the idea of 120-123, where we're talking about the premise of prevention, because ultimately avoiding loss of control in flight is really what our operation here is all about. And actively seeking ways and means to prevent it is obviously of great value to all pilots. So fully support and endorse the concepts, and I really like the way that 123 approaches it. I think one of the things that Warren mentioned is the challenge of implementation, because the more pervasive the ideas of 123 becomes, not only in well-matured flight departments, but also in training institutions, the easier it is to carry it forward. Because one of the things we're seeing with a lot of our customers that come through here is, particularly in the last couple of years, the manning levels in flight departments have been rather fluid. There's been a lot of turnover in some flight departments and stuff. So the idea of trying to keep a mature plan in place where everyone is fully aware of the premises of flight path management that are discussed in 123 may become a slightly larger challenge. So if those ideas are introduced earlier in a training institution, if you will, that's only going to help all flight departments downstream. The other thing that I really liked about 123 is the idea that it is a holistic view of the entirety of the threat spectrum, if you will, of loss of control in flight, because it talks about understanding flight path management and all the components therein, but also about how to carry that through to the unexpected or the undesired states as well. Because the basic principles of flight path management, which we're trying to use day to day in order to keep our airplane where we want it to be, can also be used in many respects if we encounter the unexpected in an upset condition or a loss of control type event. And so I really appreciate and respect the fact that 123 that talks to 109 and 111 as well, where we're talking about flight path management and how that may correlate with respects to stalls and loss of control in flight conditions. So overall, just really like what 123 is putting out there, and really appreciate the idea that our flight departments out there are working hard towards trying to encompass as much of it as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, DQ. The one thing I'll bring attention to, for example, when all you have is a hammer, everything you see is a nail, right? So we're not just talking about loss of control here because that's where APS specializes. The purpose of this diagram is really to see how the industry started mitigating methods to avoid the result of an undesired aircraft state. That terminology, undesired aircraft state, comes from threat and error management. But when you're talking about upset prevention and recovery training, that is technically an airplane upset where there's been a loss of airplane state awareness. So what this simply is when you see that little UPRT block over the top, is that UPRT is not the silver bullet. UPRT is now adding depth and, I believe, perspective to the entire mitigation, layers of mitigation of the process to further mitigate the risk of loss of control. So as we look back in history, we had advanced simulation, great. Then we had CRM, great. Then we had threat and error management, greater. And then now applying UPRT as another layer of mitigation to really drive that green arrow, which has always improved awareness and prevention. Yes, recovery is important, but really the hallmark of any effective training program, upset training or otherwise, is really for the pilot to be ahead of the airplane, to see these things coming and avoiding the development in the first place. Great comments, guys. Just fantastic. So we're going to get to you, Otter, here in just a second. And I think we've brought up all of these areas. This is simply kind of a categorization of what the advisory circular talks about as the interlinking aspects of flight path management. We've already talked about manual flight operations. We're going to be talking about automated systems in a minute. Pilot monitoring is really an important concept because it's no longer the pilot not flying. That when I was flying the airlines, it was pilot flying, pilot not flying. But the pilot monitoring is very much an active role in the mitigation of risk. And, Captain Cox did a great job about that, or talking about that, when he said, if the first officer or the pilot monitoring doesn't know what you're going to do, they have very little ability to help you mitigate the risks you may be facing. So it's just such an important concept. And then energy management is going to come up in our discussion here. So, or in our scenario that we're going to get to. But before I advance the slides into the scenario, Otter, let's go to you. You've been sitting there patiently. Is there anything here you'd like to talk about to set yourself up for the scenario that we're going to be talking about next?
I'll probably just add that from my perspective, which has been working not only with ab initio flight school students there, but all the way to the senior airline instructors at major airlines like our partners Delta and United there. And we all agree that ultimately flight path management is that core nugget that has to be continually addressed all through a pilot's career and training. There's no sense in CRM if we can't have flight path management there. But one of the issues that I think probably industry is agreeing on is those manual flight operations. That manual handling skills are degrading due to automation. But it's actually getting more complex now in the latest cycle of our industry with these massive hiring, the gaps that's narrowing, like Warren talked about. You've got pilots or junior pilots that are sitting in the right seat. They're not as familiar with the airplane. They don't know how to monitor the flight path and the energy of the airplane. They're not familiar with, say, the normal pitch attitudes and power settings that should be set, for instance, in climbs or descents, and especially between low altitude and high altitude and all. And I think that lack of confidence for a new pilot is double jeopardy for the pilot flying. He literally he can't count on that pilot monitoring to help him in so many of the manual operations that he may be doing. So this is something that I think we have as training providers and instructors. We have to keep in mind. We have to increase that competence in this area specifically quickly in order to maximize safety in all operations.
I love it. And when I'm reading the advisory circular again last night, I'm like, man, this is a pretty big ask for the industry, right? The pilot should be capable of flying the departure, the arrival, the en route portion, the entire flight manually. And in the military, as we know, with myself and Otter and DQ anyway, is that we spent a career hand flying the airplane all the time. And that's just not the way it is anymore. Now is that not only do you transition from essentially manual flight to automation on departure, but it goes back the other way. And then also a transition from pilot monitoring to pilot flying in a crisis can occur as well. And so it really is assuming that the skills to manage the flight path and the manual handling capabilities are there. And I think this advisory circular is essentially identifying that that's a deficient area. And what can operators do to try to develop those skills in training and operations? And I think the reality of operations is a great spot to do it. We have to balance that with safety as well. So, Otter, go ahead, Otter. Why don't you just kick that off from there?
Yeah, I'll just add on that. One of the feedbacks that we're getting from our partner airlines, and that is the challenges they're having with their pilots being the resistance of disengaging the auto flight system and flying it manually when they should be. The scenarios developed, the auto flight system is not working correctly or programmed correctly, whatever is not helping the situation, and they're not willing to disengage it, and likely because of that lack of competence in their manual flying skills.
Perfect. And I will just ask everybody who's attending here today, there's several hundred on the call, go ahead and put your questions in as we go through this scenario, because I think it's going to be a good one. It's just one sample we thought of that we could get in the available time that would really bring some clarity to some of the concepts that the advisory circular is talking about. So with that, Otter, over to you. There's two parts to this. There's the top of the descent portion, or the instrument or automated part of it. Then there's a circle to land portion. And I know you prepared a couple of videos that aren't meant to be ideal examples, just more of typical, situations that pilots may see in the cockpit, and what was good, what wasn't, what could be added, what could be removed, but also, as we discussed before the call, with a clear understanding, there has to be balance between information and time when we're talking about briefing and working together as a crew. So over to you, Otter, to introduce this, and just let me know when you want the video.
Yeah, I'd like everybody to understand that this was kind of a one-shot thing. I purposely put myself in a little bit of a unfamiliar scenario in the simulator, trying to replicate a more real-life situation for a crew, maybe going into a strange airfield. They're about ready to do a circling approach, and then so what I did was we were on auto flights. The autopilot was on. We're just prior to top of descent, and I finished simulating briefing the approach, a standard briefing, and then I went into kind of a threat forward type of brief, just trying to think about, all right, let's additionally talk about potential threats here on this approach there. And again, I can't say that it is ideal by any means. It was just something in the heat of where I am in this situation. This is what came out of my mind for that. But let's just have a look at it.
Great. And the only thing I'll add here is that the threat forward portion of the briefing can be before or after. And, we've talked to our airline partners. For example, I spoke to United last night, and they said, well, we actually do the threat forward before we do the approach briefing. And they have three components of it. What are the threats on this: personal, environmental, and technical, before we get into the briefing? And that kind of just cages everybody's mind to what this particular situation is all about. And then they go through the approach briefing. So it's certainly the fact that you're having it is the most important thing. And it's really a matter of policy or SOP as to where that specifically happens. So do you want me to go ahead and play that video, Otter? So this is you, top of descent, right? Just before you're going into the shoot.
Top of descent, and we're about ready to, we'll penetrate a layer of weather, and then ideally we should pop out below it with some type of visibility that's going to allow us to do the circling approach. So
okay, so I split the video, going to do top of descent, and then the second part is you're now leveling at minimum, so that's circling altitude. Okay, here we go.
All right, John, unless you have any questions on that approach briefing, I'm going to just talk about probably some of potential threats here in this unique approach for us, since we're going to be doing circle to land there. I'm going to let it remain coupled all the way down to MDA and let the autopilot level us off. I'll get the power up. Hopefully that'll get us trimmed up, and then I'll kick off the autopilot as we hand fly it into the downwind there of the approach. Obviously, that's going to be critical as I'm hand flying the airplane. Let's both keep sight of the runway, but not too far away, not too close either. As I make the turn from downwind to base to final, we're going to be judging that distance that we need, and if the visibility is bad, there could be a temptation to stay too close, potentially resulting in the need for a tight turn, and I'm not going to go for that. So watch bank angle for me. I'm not going to try to do any type of skid to try to salvage an overshoot there. So you can just be backing me up on the rudders if you would, and we'll make this approach as safe as possible. But we're not going to put up with any. We're not going to put up with anything that we're uncomfortable with. So unless you see any other threats, let's give this a try.
Okay, Otter, there you are. I don't know that you've seen it since you recorded it. What are your thoughts on that? And the comment that I would have is certainly a lot of information, but also a circle to land is very rare. I mean, I think that you going through a number of the dimensions of what could be threats at different stages of it was appropriate. But like you said, this isn't intended to be an ideal example. It's just the concept of doing a threat forward briefing at top of descent. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, in my mind, of course, I was drawing the attention to, listen, there's going to be a time in this approach where I'm going to shift off the auto flight system and be manually flying the airplane, and potentially manually flying an airplane without guidance. Literally having to figure it out on my own, my distance and how I'm going to turn and all of that. And in my mind, that was the threat at the time there. And I was hoping that what I said to my, co-pilot would help him realize that. You know what I mean? There. Now, as we're going to see in the video, in the next video, when we actually break out and I'm now actually manually flying, there were some other threats that pop up that I actually didn't address there that caused it to be quite interesting there, I think, for the approach.
So, no, I think it's great. We'll go around the room here before we move to the next section. And I think one of the things, for example, Warren talked about chapter 3, I believe, manual flight operations in the advisory circular, but it talks about the mastery of cognitive, psychomotor, and communication skills. Now, we always think about manual flying as psychomotor and certainly cognitive associated with manual flight operation proficiency. But when it comes to CRM and mitigating risk, especially in association with flight path management, your ability to communicate at top of descent and during the approach is really important. And the pilot monitoring's ability to decide what to say and how to decide and if to say anything at all is critical. So sometimes I feel like the communication element of a CRM scenario is understated to some extent. So that's my thought on it. So Otter, anything to add? Then we'll go to Warren and DQ for other comments.
No, I think you're spot on, because the ego is kind of the elephant in the room here when it comes to manually fly airplanes. I mean, we all professionals and we all, just assume that, hey, I'm good enough to be able to do this. And we don't want to show our cards in a sense. And so a lot of times we're not willing to fess up that, you know what, I may not be good at this, so what we're about to do. So,
okay. Warren, thoughts?
My only thought, Otter pointed out what he said in the simulator, let's both keep an eye on the runway, which I think was excellent. When you're pilot flying, your task saturated, your cognitive ability may shrink. It goes back to that loss of control in-flight spectrum. Your pilot flying may be in the prevention stage. They may not see an issue arising until a lot of those factors line up, but the pilot monitoring may be able to identify those factors one by one and help mitigate them early on.
DQ?
Yeah, I thought it was it's interesting because I think anyone in the position of trying to record yourself in something like that is going to come up with a list similar with some differences to what Otter brought up. And every single one of the things that's being mentioned is definitely a potential threat, and they all really show up in the premises of flight path management. He talks about automation, energy management, manual flying, lots of good pieces of information for what a pilot monitoring could be looking for, what to expect and stuff, which just really throws the question up in my mind is, wow, how challenging this would be for a pilot monitoring if we didn't do that brief in advance.
Awesome, guys. Well, it's good. I'm looking at the time. Let's go to the next slide. Now, before I do that, if you take a look at those blocks, there's 3 on the top, 2 on the bottom. We're now over at the right of the top row, transition to manual flight, and now unique flight path management threats, which can come up in the heat of the moment, and then the impact of unplanned changes or conditions. And we're going to see some of that in the next part of the scenario. So let's go ahead and advance the slide. We do have the video, Otter, but why don't you just introduce that with your thoughts on this particular segment in relation to flight path management? That's not the only threat here. That's one of the threats that we're facing.
Yeah, and I thought that threat forward briefing, I was addressing this aspect, this unique flight path management threat there. But I didn't talk about some others that are going to pop up, like you said on this last block, the impact of unplanned changes or conditions.
Yeah, and when I was talking to Brian Wright, who was the head of the UPRT program at United Airlines, he retired, 6 months ago, I think, Otter. I was talking to him last night. and actually yesterday morning. Anyway, he said one of the most important parts of a threat forward briefing is not leading the witness. In other words, as the captain, he said, and so let's say the first officer is flying, he simply says, what do you feel the threats are on this, and just listens to what they're saying to understand where their mind's at. And then he said he may add a couple things, but if not, he'll say, great, let's go do that. But the point of it is, it's not so canned that it's a checklist, right? Is that what are you feeling are the threats on this approach? Let's just talk about it in layman's terms here before we go down and do this. All right. Any other comments before we run the video? I'm assuming that's what you want to do next, Otter. Is that right? Run the video?
Yeah, let's play the video. And just so everybody knows, we've just popped out of the weather, and I've gotten sight of the runway up ahead, and we're going to go right into a left downwind. Unlike this graphic here, we'll end up going into a left downwind, basically to land on the runway going the opposite direction here. And visibility was a challenge because it ended up, I think I accidentally climbed a little bit as I'm trying to keep sight of the runway, and I popped in the weather and then popped out there. So there were actually a couple of times where I was thinking, oh my gosh, you know what, we're going to have to go around, but then I got sight of the runway again. So I think I share my thoughts, obviously, as we go through the approach here.
Yeah, so even though the graphic's the wrong way, it just occurred to me that it is now when you said that. But the video starts at point A, essentially, right? That green arrow is where we're at when we play the video. Okay. All right. Any other comments from Warren or anybody here before we start this? No? Okay, let's run the video, then we can chat about it, then go to questions. Here it comes.
All right, John, I've got the field, I got the runway. We're starting our return here. We got some rising terrain over here on the right, so you can help me watch for that. That was unfortunately a little unexpected. I'm slowing it up. I've still got the field in sight, still getting a spacing separation here. All right, I feel like I'm pretty tight here, John, on the runway. I'm still trying to get some spacing before I start my base leg here. You see the terrain over here? All right, John, looks like we just went. All right, we just popped out. All right, still got the runway. John, I'm going to go ahead and start my turn. Not much of a horizon at all, so help me watch the bank angle here as we come around. And okay, well, we just went. All right. We're losing the runway occasionally. If I lose the runway one more time, we will go around. But I've still got the runway in sight. And let's get ready to go full flaps. All right, you can bring the flaps full. Got a slight overshoot. All right, John, we're on an overshoot, and we're going to go around, go missed approach here. Let's go. Flaps 15, and there's a positive way. Gear up, please.
Awesome. Well, I think the one thing, Otter, is you're doing a great job of communicating with the other crew member. Now, I don't know if you feel like that's over or under communicating, but I think there's a lot to talk about there. So over to you, Otter, and then to Warren and DQ, and then we can go to questions.
You know, watching it now, for me, I don't feel like I over talked, but I feel like I would have done that in real life. Probably for most of that to keep my, especially since it would have been challenging for him to actually see what I was seeing. I mean, the runway was on the left, and I asked him to keep sight, but that still would have been challenging for him. So anyway, I don't feel like I over communicated, but certainly you saw that I was surprised by the rising terrain. That certainly distracted me from being able to then fly an appropriate pattern there. So that cognitive processing, in an ideal standpoint, certainly as John talked about earlier, begins to saturate you. And I was kind of popping in and out of clouds. So I was definitely continuing to get challenged there, and almost felt like I needed to even talk more, and let him know that I'm getting a little more nervous in this approach.
Well, we got some great comments coming in on thoughts of that too, Otter. I see Mark Rubens here. He had a great concept on what he would want his pilot monitoring to be doing. And so we'll maybe bring that up in a few minutes. But if I think about what is the flight path monitoring element of it, as the pilot flying, is the rising terrain, you got a ceiling of weather over you, is kind of keeping it, where it needs to be to make this a possibility for the approach, right? Not going below a circling minimum, not going into the weather, losing runway. So there's a lot going on there. Warren, over to you. Your thoughts on that?
I'll just make a quick thought. It's the more you talk out loud, though, your pilot monitoring can get a better sense of what the ADM looks like, what the aeronautical decision making looks like. We're not mind readers, right? And I think if you try and read somebody's mind, you can often come up with a false conclusion. Just to briefly jump back to the story I shared earlier, my student was talking out loud. She did barely overshoot that runway, but calling out every factor that was present, everything else was under control. So I knew exactly what her decision was going to be once she overshot that runway. And as we did in the post brief, she mentioned if any of those other factors were out of limits, her decision would have been very different to go missed.
Awesome. DQ?
Yeah, I thought that the ongoing conversation was actually really worthwhile, because if in a pilot monitoring's perspective, you kind of know what's happening and what it is that you're monitoring and keeping an eye on. I don't know that a lot of people would be communicating that effectively. Under moments of duress and stress, it's easy for people to start to go silent. And then it starts to become a much more challenging issue, if you will, for the pilot monitoring to actually know what it is that we're monitoring, what is the expected flight path, and are we deviating from it? So I thought that was a good example of something, a good path, if you will, towards enhancing that CRM through a challenging event.
Excellent. Okay, guys, we got a few minutes left. We're going to go a bit over time if you guys can stay. Warren, are you able to stay, you guys, a little bit? I'm going to start at the bottom of there's some of his comments. There are a couple of questions, but I remember Mark Rubin. He's changed jobs a few times here, but right now he's now, let me just go to his comment he made. So I think he has a great comment here on what he would want the pilot monitoring to do. Why don't you just go ahead and review that and see what you guys' thoughts are.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, I can read it. During the circle, I feel it is important for the pilot flying to verbalize the sight picture, turn initiation, essentially what they are looking at to keep the pilot monitoring in the loop. But I want the pilot monitoring inside to monitor instruments, bank angle, VREF, sync rate, then outside below approaching touchdowns for situational awareness to actual touchdown point to avoid long landing or unstable in the approach. So lots of things to say there. Very, very relevant. Otter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, and when I was shooting the approach, that's exactly what I was hoping that my co-pilot was doing. He was really watching the flight path management. I wasn't as concerned that he kept the runway in sight, and I think that's what Mark is saying here. Is let's keep him focused on just the flight path management here.
Well, here's an interesting comment from Steve. Then we'll go to Warren and DQ. And this is to Mark's comment. This is so true. Is unfortunately most pilots want to communicate their competence versus their misgiving and concern. That's a really, really astute point there. Warren, thoughts?
My only thought after reading that comment is the two situations you don't want to be in, I think we mentioned this a minute ago, is silence and trying to mind read what the other pilot's doing. But the other one is if small mistakes are being made during the circle, it's not the time to come up with excuses. So I think that's what this point gets at right here.
Exactly, guys. Okay, cool. Let me go through here now. Have a couple look here. All right. Let's go up to a point here. This is one for you, Warren. Let's bring this in. Regarding new fresh pilots out of flight school, what would you recommend for them to be able to function as a competent member of the crew? So that's kind of what the heart of what you're getting at when you're graduating students out of a flight school is for them to be valuable assets going to either a regional or the air carrier. So how would you answer that, Warren? This is a good one for you.
You know, we have a benefit being not just a flight school, but a university. And we have colleges in advanced aircraft operations where we spend a couple weeks talking about CRM. So these concepts are not new to the students when they go into flight training. What we try and do in some of our higher level lessons after the student has their commercial license is fly the aircraft in more of a multi-crew scenario instead of a single crew. And SPRM, single pilot resource management, is important. But at the same time, we don't want the student to forget that the instructor's in the right seat and the instructor is a pilot. If a situation pops up that the student needs help with, they should not be afraid to talk to their instructor and have them take on some of the tasks inside the airplane. So I just circle it back to teach the students what CRM means from the get-go, even though in primary flight training, SPRM is what they're using most of the time.
Otter, DQ, anything to add to that?
Great comment.
Cool. All right, let me just remove that. Let's bring this in. Another comment from Steve here. It's more of a comment to review. An important pilot monitoring aspect is when the pilot monitoring aligns their perspectives with the pilot flying, in effect becoming a non-flying pilot flying. Important for the pilot monitor to maintain a separate perspective to detect, identify, and intervene if necessary. And that last part, while critical, is also some of the areas of hesitation. I think that kind of brings the comment you had, Otter, previously about the reluctance to disengage the automation or intervene, especially if the pilot flying is the captain and the pilot monitoring is the first officer, right? Sometimes there can be a cultural challenge there. Thoughts, guys?
That inexperience. I mean, wow, we're getting pilots going right from a Seminole now to a large multi-engine swept-wing jet with totally, well, not totally different, but vast disparity between energy, management, which is critical to flight path management, and it's challenging in those initial hours of flying in an airplane. You just don't know. You don't know how to manage the energy well.
Any other thoughts, guys? Okay, let's go to the last one. We're going to kind of end it on a little bit of UPRT topic here by Nicholas. And I think there's a lot to, or Nicholas is it's an interesting point. I see a noticeable problem in realistic training. Most airline pilots have installed or spin an aircraft since basic training. UPRT training in traditional full motion simulators are not really suitable for realistic UPRT. Otter, what are your thoughts on that? We'll start with you, then to Warren, then DQ, and then I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one of the reasons we have a business here in this loss control and flight mitigation is we're gap training here. I mean, and most of our pilots come through here are professional pilots, and there's a number of areas that they've just kind of faded away since basic pilot training. For instance, the difference between a slip and a skid. I mean, most multi-engine pilots can't even recognize the difference. They wouldn't know whether in one or the other. So he is correct. He's on to the fact that there's certain aspects of flight path management that do get dropped as we get flying larger airplanes.
Warren?
I mean, the comment nails it. There's no replacement for on-aircraft UPRT. The visuals, the sensations on the body, and just knowing that you're not safe and sound in a simulator at sea level, you are up in an aircraft that is in that moment in an upset. There's just no replacement for it. You know, there are some schools who provide UPRT to primary students, which is good, but this comment relates to it. It doesn't do much good if it's just a one and done UPRT lesson that is never repeated for the next 40 years of a pilot's career.
Yeah. DQ?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add. I mean, I think Otter and Warren basically, articulated the issue very well. It's a very real comment, and it makes tremendous sense.
I think the one thing I would add is that there's a rule for essentially all of the traditional platforms in an effective UPRT program. We need to do a LinkedIn Live, Otter, on the contribution of different training platforms to mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight, that while simulation has limitation, it also has tremendous advantages used properly. And it can complement and reinforce effective on-aircraft upset training. So that's one of the reasons why at APS, at our headquarters, is we have all of academic on-site instructor-led training, preparatory distance learning, upset training in piston and jet airplanes. We have class-specific simulation, and then we have virtual reality for type-specific training, because they all have a role to play in the process. And if you leave any one of those out, you're leaving some risk on the table. And most importantly, when you're implementing those solutions, is they should complement and overlay each other to further develop the competencies and resilience of the pilot in a real-world situation. And the real-world part of it is best accomplished in real-world training. So, startle, surprise, fear is really tough to generate in a simulator, but done properly and on aircraft, it can really help pilots have, a level of competence and confidence that is real as opposed to assumed. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody out there who took time out of their busy day to join us live or watching the recording. And to our great speakers here today, Otter, DQ, thank you so much for being here, taking time out of the very, very busy flying schedule we have here at APS. And Warren, big thank you to you and your time. Just great to have you here. You're doing great things on the MBAA Safety Committee. Thank you for all your effort and your work there and everything you're doing at the Florida Institute of Technology. So guys, thank you for being here. We will see you next time. So bye-bye.